what's up everybody? Welcome to FoundFlix. I'm coming to you from what's become a very familiar site, my couch. I haven't been getting off my fat ass for quite some time now. Coming to you from day 3,742 of lockdown or something like that. But you know, since we can't go outside, there is one thing that we can do, and that's check out a bunch of horror movies. So that's what we're gonna be doing here today, is giving you a big fat list of a whole bunch of horror movies to keep you occupied from what's going on outside. Don't go outside ever again. That's basically the takeaway at this point. So first and foremost, the kind of best and unparalleled service around for horror stuff is Shudder. Now this isn't an ad or anything like that. They really are just, there's no comparison to what they have to offer. And right now you can get a 30-day trial for free by using the code SHUTIN. And imagine how much shit you can watch in 30 days. A lot, I promise you that much. And again, it's not an ad or anything. That's just, it's a cool offer that they're doing right now. And unfortunately, since I'm in the US, I can't really always say where these things are going to be available or, you know, what country the Shudder's in. And I'd seen somebody also on Twitter that's in Portugal, I believed, and Shudder is not available there. So probably going to be the most useful for people in the US where I am. I'm sorry about that. Doing my best. So let's start off with Shudder and kind of my collection of classics. These are all not necessarily the most obscure, but all things that are available on there and, you know, definitely worth a watch if you haven't seen them before. And even if you have, give them a watch again. That's the beauty of having nothing else to do. First off, I'm sure that you've seen these before, but oh, there's Gigi, one of my cats. I figured that would happen. That's what I get for filming in my office. What are you doing, boy? Let's kick it off with Friday the 13th. I'm sure you guys know all about Jason Voorhees and what he's up to, but on Shudder they have 1 through 8. That's basically like the entire original series. The whole thing is available, so if you've missed any of those along the way, you know, you can check out the entire thing. They also have the first Halloween and 4 and 5 for some reason, so you can see the original and then the 2 with Jamie Lloyd if you want those as well. They don't have the whole series, unfortunately, in that regard. And then next we got Escape from New York. John Carpenter at his absolute peak. You got Kurt Russell. He plays Snake Plissken, one of his most classic characters ever, you know, kind of badass criminal dude, and he's forced into, you know, this whole thing because of the government and the, you know, apocalyptic New York and all this stuff. It's just, it's awesome. It's a dynamite movie. Then suddenly shifting to a lot stranger with brain damage. You've got this kind of weird brain worm slug thing that attaches to the back of your neck, and Elmer is the name of the little worm guy, and the actual just practical effects of that thing alone and the weird voice that it has is plenty, but it also goes into some pretty demented directions overall from the same director that did Basket Case, if you've seen any of those. So that might give you an idea of what you're in for with this one. Another wonderfully 80s one, Street Trash, where a bunch of homeless people end up in a kind of gang war over cheap liquor called Viper that actually kind of destroys your insides. It's just really gritty and gross, and I don't know, there's something that's just very skeezy about the whole thing, and I really appreciate that. Switching gears over to some Italian horror flicks, we've got Demons 1 and 2. The first one has a lot of great gore, and you know, a lot of it takes place in a theater, and there's this, you know, mask that ends up turning people into demons. They're kind of like zombies, but technically they're demons and not zombies. The second one moves things to a high-rise building where the actual demons come out of a TV and into the real world. And, you know, that one's good too, but it actually has a really awesome punk soundtrack as well, so that's kind of an odd thing about it that also I appreciate. From the infamous Full Moon Pictures, we have Sorority Babes in the Slimeball Bowl-a-Rama. That is a mouthful. This is chock full of low-budget trashy stuff and gratuitous nudity, weird effects, and dumb jokes, all the stuff that we've come to love about Full Moon. Again, another kind of sleazy one, but it's a lot of fun, and the actual imp character that they eventually unleash via a bowling trophy that they find is it's just goofy. Moving on to another grotesque classic, we have Society from Brian Usna, who worked on some of the Reanimator movies. This guy's done all kinds of stuff. It's a kind of satirical look at 80s culture and, you know, the people trying to look their best and getting plastic surgery and all this stuff, but there's this kind of elite society that they're kind of like aliens, I guess. There's a lot of uncomfortably bizarre sexual things peppered in there, and it all leads to this insane mound of flesh climax with some psychotic special effects courtesy of Screamin' Mad George that really stick with you. Back in the 80s, there were a trilogy of movies directed by Stuart Gordon, who recently passed, unfortunately, and also starring Barbara Crampton and Jeffrey Combs. The first one was Reanimator, and the actual second one that they did was From Beyond, another H.P. Lovecraft adaptation. It involves, you know, experimentations to the other side side, and they of course end up backfiring and bringing stuff back over. And yeah, it's really awesome, and it's got a lot of, again, weird weird sex stuff and whatever, but it also has a bunch of weird ass gore and practical effects creatures, perhaps most infamously including a nodule thing that grows out of Combs' head. Looks like a penis. It's messed up, that's for sure, but it's also definitely a classic. And actually the third one that they did was called Castle Freak, and I don't believe that that is an H.P. Lovecraft story, but it's another full moon picture that I think Empire back in the day, actually pre-full moon, and at the time Charles Band, the guy, owned a castle in Italy, and that was actually their hub of production, and so they used this castle for the setting of Castle Freak appropriately. Crampton and Combs play a kind of troubled couple with a young daughter, and you know, they wind up discovering that this weird guy who has no genitals and all this other stuff. It's always weird when you get these three together, that's for sure. Another classic slasher that definitely is you know, a pretty blatant ripoff of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but not in a bad way. I mean, so what? He's got a chainsaw. What's the big deal? The kind of, you know, pieces of the title and what that means is that he's actually taking a piece from each of his victims in order to create a, you know, puzzle out of their flesh. So another very memorable, it's gory, it's got a lot of messed up stuff that happens in it too, and you know, it's definitely a slasher classic. Even if it is a bit derivative, that's not always a bad thing. Already I've rambled too much, so we're gonna have to kind of pick up the pace a little bit here as we move on to the kind of newer stuff and some exclusive stuff that you can only get on Shudder, starting with Daniel Isn't Real, which I really enjoyed this one. Patrick Schwarzenegger is, you know, obviously Arnold's son, and he's a handsome boy, just like his daddy, but he looks more like Patrick Bateman, I would say, than his actual beefed up dad or whatever. But it's basically the story of a kid and his imaginary friend Daniel that he develops when he's a child, and it sort of suppresses it for years, and then as an adult comes back to haunt him, and there ends up being a lot more to it. Is Daniel real, or is he not real, and what's the whole deal there? Well, you're gonna have to watch it to find out. Tigers Are Not Afraid is probably one of the best overall horror movies that I've seen in a while, and kind of calling it a horror movie doesn't really accurately describe the whole thing. It's a Spanish film featuring a bunch of kids that are kind of living in a town that it's overrun by drug lords, and they're kind of just struggling to survive. But it has kind of this fantastical touch that made me think of like Guillermo del Toro or something like that, where it's kind of this dichotomy of the real world and then mixing it with fantasy. The kids in this are amazing. That's the thing. The actual acting is like off the charts, especially the lead girl and the lead boy. You know, it has a lot of heartbreaking stuff. I mean, again, this one's got a lot jammed into it and is exceptionally well done, and that's another Shudder exclusive. Bag Boy, Lover Boy. I don't even know where to tell you with this one. Like, similar to the 80s ones that I described, oh, it's got a little sleaze, it's a little weird in this case. This one kind of goes all in with that, where you've got this kind of misfit guy who's very odd, and he works at a hot dog stand in New York, and of course ends up being a killer, and you know, it turns his victims into hamburgers for the customers to eat at the hot dog stand. That's really only scraping the surface of the weirdness of this one, and I mean, it's like 70 minutes long, but it's got so much crazy shit jam-packed into that very short runtime. Satanic Panic isn't necessarily like the best movie ever, but it's a fun way to kill an hour and a half. I mean, you've got you know, a pretty good cast. You know, Rebecca Romaine is playing like a head leader of a coven, and you know, there's this whole ritual that they're going through, and this delivery driver young lady gets sucked into the whole thing. This goes for more laughs than necessarily scares, but it does have some decent gore and some kind of odd ideas that I do appreciate. It didn't quite stick the landing necessarily, but it's still a lot of fun, and you know, that's always a winner in my book too. Was it a amusing use of 90 minutes of your time, especially when you got nowhere to go? Yes. In the Mouth of Madness, another John Carpenter one from 95, I believe, starring Sam Neill. This one is almost an H.P. Lovecraft homage through a John Carpenter filter. Sam Neill plays a guy that's investigating this missing author that's basically a riff on Stephen King, and he ends up in this small town, and the town is consumed by evil. It's got a lot of crazy twists and turns to it, and it's really a lot of fun, and also just like totally bizarre, and it's got a lot of classic H.P. Lovecraft. You want tentacles? We got tentacles, baby. Don't worry about that. Dog Soldiers. Gotta have a werewolf movie in the mix, right? And this one definitely does things a little differently, because you've got a group of soldiers that are actually going up against a werewolf, and I believe it's in Scotland. Don't quote me on that. This comes from Neil Marshall, the guy that did The Descent, and he's just got a real eye for how to make a horror movie, and especially kind of doing a unique twist on the werewolf idea and all that stuff. Demon is a Polish movie, I believe, and it follows a man, and he's getting married, and he kind of winds up finding out about this very rural community, and there's this curse on the town, and he winds up sort of becoming possessed over time. You don't really know what's going on through a lot of it. Just very different and interesting and unique, and that happens with a lot of foreign movies. They're usually a lot more experimental, and it presents things in a way that you don't know where things are going. You're kind of always on your toes. On the complete opposite end of the spectrum is Tammy and the T-Rex. I don't know what to tell you about this. This shit is goofy. I mean, the whole idea is it's got Denise Richards and Paul Walker in their actual Hollywood debuts. First of all, Paul Walker ends up getting killed. The two of them are dating, and a mad scientist, Bernie from Weekend at Bernie's, winds up putting his brain into the body of an animatronic Tyrannosaurus Rex. It plays things pretty straight, but just the inherent ridiculousness of the idea really adds a lot to it. This one's just absolutely bonkers. The Headhunter is one that's very simple. It's just a guy, and it takes place in the remote countryside, and there's a actual monster that's out in the woods, and it killed his daughter, and so he's out there trying to get revenge, and it does a lot with very limited means, and I do appreciate that too. I think it's literally just like the one guy, the Headhunter, for like 99% of the movie for the most part, but it still manages to do a lot with those very limited, budget and means. Wax Mask is one that feels like it should have come from the 70s or 80s potentially, but it's from 1997. It actually was, the story is Dario Argento and Fulci as well, so it kind of makes sense of why it feels like a kind of throwback. But it's basically, a murderer runs a wax museum and starts, using the bodies that he gets from his murders to create ultra realistic displays at a wax museum, and, ends up drawing some suspicion. The Wailing is probably one of the most traumatizing and horrifying and just all over the map. Like, this movie is a lot. It's scary, tense, it's everything, and it's basically like, this kind of demon creature that you don't really quite get the gist of it, but it's all these ritualistic elements to it, and suffice to say, this one, especially, South Korean movies, they a lot of times are able to push the envelope in a way that, again, we don't see a lot in American movies, and this one is kind of like the king of the heap in that sense of being like, holy shit, for 2.5 hours. If you haven't seen Mandy yet, what is wrong with you? This thing is amazing. You got Nicolas Cage, and he's probably one of his best performances, if not his best performance ever, and it comes from Panos Cosmatos, who did Beyond the Black Rainbow, so it's really trippy, and it's got a lot of, interesting kind of homages as far as like, 80s horror films, Evil Dead and Hellraiser and things like that, but really doing his own stamp on those versus feeling like just a total ripoff or something like that. It's very odd as far as the overall tone of the movie and the feel of it, so stick with it, and I promise it'll be worth it. Give it like 30 minutes and it'll start rolling with you. An actual classic giallo movie from Dario Argento, one of his earliest ones, Deep Red, kind of set the stage for a lot of what his movies would, the sort of format of what his movies are later. You've got a killer and you're following his POV all the time, and he's wearing black gloves. It's just a very like standard thing in Italian giallo movies. And the Goblin soundtrack is definitely another thing too. It's just so of its time. I mean, it's almost like distracting at this point because it's so almost Baroque, weird synth music and all this stuff. It's a good one to see as far as like a solid foundation of what classic Italian horror movies are, and is Dario Argento at one of his best. So check that one out. Starry Eyes I really like for a lot of reasons. The actual gore and everything is sort of a body horror inspired by Cronenberg perhaps, but it's a young actress in LA, and it's sort of like, what are you willing to do in order to become successful? She winds up getting, sucked into this kind of underground of these weird creature guys and all this stuff. It's got a lot going for it too, and again, just the body horror stuff is super uncomfortable in this one, so it definitely will get under your skin in that sense. When it comes to anthology movies, there's a lot out there nowadays, and some of them are pretty hit or miss, but Southbound is one that I like a lot because it does things a little differently, where it feels like everything kind of ties together into one whole, rather than feeling like just very disparate segments that don't really all come to a conclusion. And it's from some of the same guys that did the VHS series, but I feel like this one kind of just a little more artistic in a way. Yeah, it's definitely a good anthology movie, so at least was trying to get one of those on the list. Yeah, another exclusive that they have on there is all 3 of the Hell House LLC movies, and I'm a big fan of these. I would say maybe the first one was still the best, and it kind of, lost it a little bit along the way, so you can check all those out. These are kind of a good pinnacle of found footage horror movies, and especially the first one I feel like did the found footage style very, very well, and actually used that to create a lot of memorable scares too. And 2 and 3 aren't quite at the same level, but they still do a lot of interesting things with the overarching story that definitely makes it all feel like a complete trilogy overall. If you haven't seen House of the Devil, this is definitely a slow burn 80s style. It's set in the 80s horror movie from Ty West. This is probably his best one that he did. The extent that it goes to try to recreate that 80s feeling is very impressive. I mean, even just the visual look of the whole thing feels that way. And this is the definition of a slow burn kind of horror movie. It can be almost like tedious to sit through until you get to those, you know, final 15 minutes or so, but it's definitely worth it. And again, I just like it so much because of the style and tone, and it definitely evokes the feeling that it's trying to in a very successful way. Another exclusive that I like a lot is called Prevenge, and it stars Alice Lowe, who I know from Dark Place, and I don't know where Dark Place is available to stream, but if you can find that show, check it out. She stars in it, wrote it, and directed, and it's all about a woman who is pregnant and, you know, finds out about these other people out there in the world that are somehow, you know, bad people, and basically is trying to get revenge on them, you know, and it's like her baby is talking to her through her body and all this stuff. Again, it's just really weird and very unique. You know, it's just a very different side of her from Dark Place as well. And lastly, some other exclusive stuff they have as far as like TV sort of stuff is concerned. If you don't know who Joe Bob Briggs is, then do yourself a favor. They've got his new show, The Last Drive-In, available on Shudder. This guy is second to none when it comes to like drive-in and obscure horror movie knowledge. And there's several movies on there already that he's done. It's not dissimilar to what like me or James does as far as providing background and all these other facts and interesting tidbits about the movie, but this guy's pretty much the king, and they've got tons of stuff already available and a new season of the show coming soon. So catch up now and you'll be ready when the new season starts. And in the same token, they've got a show that's probably the best horror TV show that's around, and I don't even know how long. I mean, geez, years, I would say at this point. Channel Zero, and they've got all 4 of the seasons on there. It's kind of like American Horror Story, where each season is totally different and, you know, a different story. There's some degrees of which ones I liked more than others, but all 4 of them are awesome. And this stuff, I mean, I'm genuinely was shocked that this was on the Sci-Fi Channel originally, because it's actually like extremely well crafted. It's well written, and it's got a lot of interesting stuff. And depending on the season, it's got more horror or more sci-fi or just more weird stuff. There's a lot to love about this show. Well, that does it for Shudder. And wow, I already rambled way more than I thought I would. I just checked. I've already got like 30 minutes of footage, so I'm definitely gonna have to pick up the pace. The next service that we'll be looking at is TUBI TV, and this is available on your phone, on Roku, on all kinds of places, and it's entirely free, but it is ad-based. So all the movies are uncut, but there are ads on it, like if you were watching it on TV, but again, uncut. So that's kind of the nice thing about it. And this one is a bit of a mess. Like if you're trying to like find something, and even when you go to the horror genre page, it's just like all kinds of crap, you know, a bunch of weird like softcore horror movies and stuff, which, you know, maybe you're looking for those too. That's fine. Yeah, they got plenty of those. There's some Full Moon on there as well, and also some Shout Factory, another horror releasing label, has some on there, including like Mystery Science Theater episodes and stuff like that. May is one that's from Lucky McKee. It's about an odd girl, and, you know, she goes through this whole experience. That's definitely one of my all-time favorites. I used to have it up on my shelf. I don't anymore on my set, but yeah, check that one out. The Ninth Gate, you got Johnny Depp and, you know, kind of involved in this whole, you know, what is the Ninth Gate? And yeah, it's like a hell thing. It's good. Again, I'm trying to be quick here. The Conjuring, what, you haven't seen The Conjuring? Get on it. We know what's wrong with you. But, you know, if you have already, that's fine too. And they've got it for free there. I think it's also on Netflix, but yeah, again, if you don't have Netflix, that's sort of the whole point. Clown, you know, I'm not much for Eli Roth, but he only produced this one, so maybe that's why this one was a little more up my alley. You got a guy that puts on this weird ancient clown suit, and it winds up fusing to his body and sort of puts him through this body transformation where he becomes a clown. It's really weird. Really weird. I like that one too. Return of the Living Dead. In the times after Night of the Living Dead and that whole series, in the 80s especially, there were these kind of, for lack of a better term, copycat movies that were kind of also zombie films, but this one, it's about toxic waste, and you know, so it has one of the classic characters from this is Tar Man. Yes, it's really funny. It's sort of almost like a parody of Night of the Living Dead, more the punk 80s version of Night of the Living Dead. That's a good way to describe it. P2 is a very simple but effective thriller. You've got a girl trapped in a parking garage, and the security guy who you think is on her side, but maybe he's not. So, and it's a lot of tension that it's able to build, and the you know, very thrilling overall. It has a lot of good suspense that builds over the course of things, and again, with a very limited idea and scope, it is able to be a very memorable thriller. Midnight Meat Train, you know, it got Bradley Cooper in it. This one just lost a recent vote on the channel, but I like this one a lot. You know, Brad Cooper is a photographer in New York, and he stumbles across this kind of underground society of these butchers, and Vinnie Jones is a big bulky killer guy, and so he kind of gets sucked into this whole, again, underworld underneath the city of New York. It's got all 3 Sleepaway Camp movies. You haven't seen Sleepaway Camp? Check them out. They're similar to Friday the 13th, but definitely got their own bend on things with Angela the killer, and you don't really know. The first one is actually probably my least favorite. I like the kind of goofier tone of 2 and 3. All 3 of them are on there. Check it out. They got the first Cube. That's kind of the pioneer when it comes to similar like puzzle room style things like Saw or whatever, traps and stuff like that. This is much more sci-fi than horror, but again, does a great job with not a lot of budget. And, again, was very influential, especially at the time, and led to a lot of other movies very similar to it. Even The Platform, I would say, was not too far off from that. It's kind of the OG of all those. They also have the original Suspiria, not the remake, but Dario Argento, and this is probably his best movie, that, in my opinion at least. He's very well known for his colors and the overall stocks of films and the way he lights things, and that kind of adds so much more to it beyond the actual story itself, which is kind of, middling or whatever. But, again, it's got a lot of memorable kills, and one of my all-time favorites. Abominable is more recent, and so you're like, Abominable Snowman, or what's the deal? Yeah, basically, but this is a very straightforward kind of horror movie. Again, it's not necessarily like the best around, but it's really entertaining. I don't know, again, I liked it a lot, and it actually had some decent scares and surprises and stuff, and again, gives you a nice Abominable Snowman kind of horror movie. You don't get enough of those, in my opinion. The Gate is definitely one of those classics from when I was a kid. You've got baby Steven Dorff in there and everything. There's a family, and they live in the house, and they open up a gate, and all these little critters come out, and yeah, it's really interesting and a lot of fun, and just, it's sort of a good in-between horror movie, like not too scary or gory or anything like that, but also just the way it was shot as far as the forced perspective stuff with the creatures. So they actually look a lot better than they do in a lot of these, special effects don't age too well a lot of times. But in this case, they do. Lake Mungo is a documentary style thing with a missing girl. And I don't know, this is one of those that it's like, if you watch it alone in your room at night and like you're just sitting there in the dark, you will get invested into it, and this thing will scare the piss out of you. I don't know what to tell you. I mean, it's like anybody that I know that's seen this movie, especially watching it by themselves, it just gets under your skin. It's so interesting how well it does with that documentary format, and this one definitely deserves a lot more recognition. It's very well done, and again, just scary without being like overtly, jump scares or anything like that. Another Stuart Gordon one, Dagon, and also another H.P. Lovecraft, where you've got a guy that goes to a like remote Spanish village, as I recall, and finds this whole underground thing going on there too. There's a lot of that, the secret society that's been around, and there's this fish lady. It's weird. It's really weird. You're gonna want to check this one out. And again, it's Stuart Gordon, so it's one of his later ones, so it's a little bit different perhaps than the other stuff. I like this one a lot. It's got a very kind of like painful feeling to it. Just some stuff that you're like, no, that can't be happening. And the ending is pretty brutal, as I recall as well. The Stuff, another of my favorite from the 80s, where it's a kind of a take on 80s consumerism. You got this weird yogurt substance that this company digs out from under the ground and winds up selling it all over the place, but it basically turns people into mindless zombies. And Michael Moriarty is this actor who's been in a couple of stuff like It's Alive 3 and stuff like that. He's got his weird southern drawl, and that adds a lot to the movie. His just whole persona and his character, it's a lot. But yeah, it's got a lot of weird special effects, and just the overall concept itself is really funny and entertaining. Got to at least have one Mario Bava movie on the list, and Black Sunday definitely fits the bill. It's probably his most well-known one, but if you haven't seen any of his movies, this is definitely a good place to start. This is like that perfect classic, like even more, pre-Giallo, where it's that almost like Hammer film style, very like gothic horror. Definitely check this one out if you haven't seen it either. Last but certainly not least from Tubi is Invaders from Mars, the 80s remake, and this is directed by Tobe Hooper, who did the original Texas Chainsaw, as well as Life Force and a couple other things. And it's written by Dan O'Bannon, who wrote Alien as well, so you got some pedigree there. It's almost like a kid's horror movie where, you've got a classic alien invasion, and one little kid's trying to figure the whole thing out. It's just, again, it's very classic, and it's a good one that's not too over the top as far as gore or violence or anything like that. Geez, guys, sorry I ended up rambling a lot more than I anticipated. I'm pretty good at that. That's sort of the main thing I do most of the time. So I'm gonna go ahead and wrap this video up, and so that gives us the actual main free selections that we have available right now to get your horror fix in these difficult times. So again, Shudder, use the code SHUTIN to get 30 days for free, and then you can just cancel it afterwards but I have a feeling you're gonna wind up wanting to keep it anyway. It's only like $5 a month, and again, is by far the best horror service out there. And then as far as Tubi, that's available everywhere too, and it's totally free. There's no subscription or anything. It's just got ads on it. So, you know, there's still a lot more actually that I wanted to include on this list. And so I'm gonna have to actually break this up into a second video that I'll make sure to, you know, do soon. And well, that'll wrap it up for now. And we'll be looking at the, you know, what's available on Prime and Hulu and Netflix in our next part. So make sure to stay tuned for that. And if there's anything that I missed on Shudder or TUBI TV that you feel like people need to know about, leave it in the comments below and I'll try to include it in that part 2 of the video. All right, guys, thanks so much for watching. Make sure to stay safe, wash your hands, obviously, and stay indoors. Watch horror movies. That's the safest bet. And never go outside again. There's nothing out there anyway.